Professor Kenneth Paul Tang, tenured associate professor at the National University of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public School. Well, I'm very delighted to learn that in the coming year he will be taking up a tenured professorship at the Baptist University in Hong Kong. So we'll see him a lot more often in the near future. Besides dedicated educators, he works. His research areas span the cultural politics and cultural policies, and also the various issues of governance in Singapore. I think he's also, from the data I have, he's also very active in the cultural scene, in the art scene, and being involved in quite a number of organizations in the cultural industries in Singapore. So we'll hear it from Professor Tang then.
Thank you so much for a lovely introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity. I want to actually approach this a little bit differently. I want to think about Singapore's middle class, not so much as an economic or sociological or cultural set of facts, but rather to think of it in terms of ideological constructs, three in particular, which are sites of hegemonic struggle. And I think of these constructs as being part of an evolving and contested national narrative that provides some kind of orientation in the transition that Singapore has made from a post-colonial, survivalist, developmental nation state to a neoliberal global city. So the first construct that I want to describe is the middle class as a signifier of developmental state success. The post-colonial state in Singapore was led by a team of elite, Western-educated nationalist bourgeoisie. They were the founding fathers of the ruling People's Action Party, we call them the PAP. And these leaders took a very muscular modernization approach to develop Singapore and to prepare its people for middle-class industrial life. Newly independent, these people had been viewed through colonial lenses as both lazy natives as well as unruly protesters. Through a very massive effort to resettle people into rapidly built public housing estates, through educational reform, through public health measures, through a greening of the island into what was called then a garden city, through social campaigns and through draconian measures of political and social control, the people were effectively transformed into a modern, hygienic, urban, and industrialized society. The state, embedded in the economy, was highly interventionist, particularly in its industrial policies. It was determined to attract foreign capital right from the start, right, to invest in Singapore. Industrial relations laws and policies that sought to harmonize the interests of employers, employees, and government effectively tamed the labor force and eliminated the more militant union activity. Eventually, the economy was dominated by government-linked companies, or GLCs, and multinational companies, or MNCs, which effectively crowded out domestic capital and grossly reduced the space and prospects for small and medium enterprises. The majority of the people were destined, in fact, for salaried employment in public service, in the GLCs, and in the MNCs. The 70s and 80s saw very impressive economic growth and development. Singapore, of course, with Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan, was described as an East Asian tiger economy. Material prosperity at the national level translated into individual prosperity as people saw their lives improve in just a few decades after independence. Rapid and widespread material improvement and benefit also became the basis of social stability. And through a materially transactional social compact, the authority of the PAP government has been nourished over many decades of its electoral dominance. The state was also able to convince the people that their well-being depended on their own individual hard work and sacrifice, which would always be rewarded, according to this narrative. So while the state almost automatically subsidized good quality public housing, education, and healthcare for the middle class, it was more sparing with direct financial assistance for needier Singaporeans who had failed to reach middle class status. In fact, up until today, there has not been an across the board minimum wage for Singaporean workers. Meanwhile, the middle class tax burden has also been kept relatively light. Singapore's labor force was, however, insufficient to meet the needs of a rapidly growing economy and city. So birth rates were also starting to fall, a result of effective post-colonial anti-natal policies, as well as natural trend towards smaller families in modern societies. So to make up for this shortfall, the government opened the economy to migrant workers fairly early on, particularly in the areas of construction and domestic help. The latter enabled more Singapore women to enter the workforce. In the late 1970s, the government introduced major structural reforms to the economy, which raised incomes and incentivized investments to increase productivity and high technology in the economy. By 1987, the Prime Minister then, Lee Kuan Yew, could declare that 80% of Singaporeans were middle class. Embourgeoisement of Singapore society obscured, in fact, the growing structural inequalities and the exploitative practices of a more profoundly capitalist society. Middle class values in Singapore were a mixture of nouveau riche consumerist materialism, fixation on career success and a prerequisite of educational success, and a conservatism that sometimes took the form of an attachment to Asian values. In this upwardly mobile society, middle-class Singaporeans aspired to own bigger homes in better districts, which often increased their chances of enrolling their children in good quality or even elite schools. They enrolled their children in extra tuition and other enrichment classes to give them an advantage over other children. In the late 1970s, with a view to leaving no one behind, the government reformed the education system to stream more able students into academic programs and the less able students into technical and vocational programs. This was also a time when Lee Kuan Yew often talked about talent in terms of eugenics. Policies were introduced to encourage more highly educated women to get married earlier and to have children. The worry, which was implicitly racial, was that better educated Singaporeans would have smaller families, while less educated Singaporeans would have large families. Also in the late 1970s, the government became concerned that overly materialistic, consumerist, and competitive middle class Singaporeans in an industrial society would lack a strong enough sense of identity and belonging, belonging to the country as well as to one another. So the transactional basis of Singapore citizenship needed to be enriched by a transformational agenda. Hence, the focus shifted, in fact, to enhance civic, moral, and even religious education as a means of anchoring a multiracial citizenry onto a more emotionally satisfying national identity. Now, this first ideological construction of Singapore's middle class signifies successful development policies and governance by a strong state with the PAP at the helm. It justifies the institution of meritocracy as a non-discriminatory, socially equalizing force through the expansion of opportunity so that all who work hard and possess the talents that Singapore values can rise higher in life. It also identifies deficiencies in the middle class that will continue to require state intervention. Let me move to the second construct. And this is the middle class as a signifier of resistance to political change. So according to many versions of modernization theory that we're very familiar with, authoritarian states that are able to generate economic growth will produce a middle class that seeks higher order goals beyond the physiological and the transactional. To get their voices heard, the middle class will demand for more opportunities to participate in collective decision making, for example, through a more inclusive democratic structure and practice. This can amount to saying that the middle class is an engine of democratization. But in contrast, Singapore's middle class has been weaned on a culture of anxiety. First, this is manifested in a national siege mentality, the fear that Singapore will collapse because of its essentially vulnerable nature. Singapore's natural resources are scarce, and it faces geopolitical threats constantly. Today, it's the impact of US-China relations. So the individual fate of Singapore's middle class depends profoundly on the success or failure of the nation. But the second sense of this culture of anxiety has to do with how the middle class came from, how the middle class anxiety came from competitiveness in the education system and subsequently in the careers that they pursued. So kiasu, which in the Hokkien language means fear of losing, has been explicitly and sometimes even favorably embraced as a Singaporean characteristic, an instantiation of its pursuit of success, its principle of meritocracy. So the focus and the energy of the middle class were in fact directed onto the pursuit of success, the capacity to earn enough to support a consumption-centered lifestyle that could signal one's arrival and worthiness of success, of respect. There was no time or energy for public matters that were too complicated anyway, and would be best left in the protective hands of an elite government. So this engendered a kind of faith in meritocracy, which was mainly manifested, for instance, in the prestigious public sector scholarships that are given out every year. They also amounted to high levels of trust in the government and other public institutions that would surely, according to this faith, be populated by the brightest and the best. So the government was also the biggest employer in Singapore, and all of this amounted to a comfortable coupling of the paternalistic state and an infantilized middle-class citizenry. However, even though the government could rely solidly on a middle-class base for electoral support, there were early signs in the 80s of middle-class support for parliamentary opposition. Some members of the upper middle class also started to form civil society groups that were animated by such causes as women's issues, ethnic minority issues, and the environment. In 1987, a group of mainly middle-class professionals, including social workers, lawyers, theater practitioners, feminist activists, and Catholic priests, they organized themselves against exploitation of migrant workers, whose numbers were rising. 22 of them were detained without trial under the Internal Security Act, and they were accused of trying to subvert Singapore system in order to establish a Marxist state. That's a very outlandish accusation. But the repressive actions of the state then have cast a long and rather menacing shadow over civil society and the prospects of a more challenging activism in Singapore. Now, to resist the critical appeal of liberal democratic and social democratic discourse, the state sought to envelop the materialistic culture of the middle class, which, for the most part, continues to guarantee political apathy. They tried to envelop this with the discourse first of Confucianism, then Asian values, then shared values, and then a full-fledged national propaganda effort described as national education. So this second ideological construct that I've just described aimed to consolidate a politically and ideologically homogeneous middle class, effectively depoliticized by directing their attention to the demands of a competitive system and the promise of material reward. Meritocracy secured the infantilization of the middle class under the benevolent gaze of a paternalistic state. Fashioned as a conservative silent majority, the idea of the middle class could be summoned whenever demands for change or liberalization in general needed to be dismissed. Let me now talk about the third and last construct, and this is the middle class as a signifier of precarity in a neoliberal global city. So the 90s saw a deepening of Singapore's embeddedness in globalization. In this neoliberal global city, among the most open and technologically wired in the world, the middle class started to fracture and to fragment. Economic crises have come more often and in more severe forms. Economic growth has slowed down, and socioeconomic inequality has become not only wider, but also more multi-layered and complex. Today, studies have shown that Singaporeans are among the most sleep-deprived in the world, and they work some of the longest hours each day. Unsurprisingly, depression rates are among the highest in Asia. The birth rates are among the lowest in the world. And this constitutes a fundamental source of existential anxiety. For decades, many of the most qualified, entrepreneurial and mobile among the middle class have emigrated, sometimes for better career prospects, sometimes for more physical space, and sometimes for more political space. The government has described them as cosmopolitan Singaporeans, in contrast with heartlander Singaporeans who are romanticized as the essential core of the country. At other times, the government has criticized Singaporeans who leave as quitters, in contrast with the stayers who remain even when times are hard. Today, highly skilled middle-class Singaporeans in many sectors and professions can compete for top global salaries. Many have joined the highly mobile class of global talent, which includes the creative class. Now, to make up for the brain drain and the below replacement level birth rates in Singapore, the government has relied heavily, especially since the mid-2000s, on the inflow of foreign talent to create a brain gain and thus to refresh and even upgrade the middle class. While Singaporeans appreciate the need for foreign talent and they welcome the socio-cultural vibrancy of living in a cosmopolitan city, they nevertheless have started to be skeptical about whether the incoming foreigners are as talented as they are made out to be. They ask whether the government has been discriminate enough in admitting foreigners into the workforce, particularly to take up top leadership and management positions. They point to discriminatory hiring practices that disadvantage Singaporeans and to glass ceilings that limit their prospects. They question the education system in Singapore, which, although highly regarded globally, seems unable to prepare Singaporeans for these top jobs. As world-class Singaporeans leave for better prospects, middle-class Singaporeans who are left behind have many good reasons to feel resentful and mistrustful of their government. Now, since the Asian financial crisis of 1997, income inequality has risen significantly in Singapore. Although the Gini coefficient, the Gini index started to fall since 2012 due to more deliberate redistributive policies, the current levels are still much higher than the OECD average today, pointing even to the possibility of social unrest. In the very near future, the fourth industrial revolution is expected to change the nature of work and the economy in very fundamental ways through digital technology, automation, artificial intelligence, and the Internet of Things. While these disruptive developments open up opportunities for liberating the middle class from the burdens of unnecessary labor and transforming their work, perhaps, into a more creative human endeavor, these disruptive developments also pose threats as far as unemployment and inequality are concerned. Many middle-class Singaporeans, even the highly qualified and experienced, will lose their jobs and have lost their jobs and will not be able to adapt to the demands of the new economy. In the context of high cost of living and of doing business, many will be forced to enter the low end of the gig economy. These disruptions have already been amplified by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has, much sooner than expected, rendered the middle class precarious. Today, migrant workers still provide cheap and unskilled labor in abundance, doing work that Singaporeans have found undesirable, for wages that Singaporeans would find unacceptable for themselves. However, as more members of the Singapore middle class start to lose their jobs and have to compete with this pool of migrant workers, the lowest salaries of Singaporeans will be greatly depressed. Now, the government has been committed to financing and implementing national programs for continuing education and training, CET, to help the Singapore middle class reskill or upskill so that they can become re-employable. CET can also instill capabilities for lifelong learning, adaptability, and resilience. While these programs may have a longer-term impact, their immediate ability to mitigate the problems of the middle class in Singapore is really, really limited. So now neoliberal globalization has created the conditions for further economic flourishing, but it has also increased hardship for a significant segment of the middle class. And this is the segment that feels left behind and betrayed by their own government. Anti-elite and anti-establishment sentiments are growing, as witnessed in the results of the recent general elections. Anger towards the government's immigration policies may slide into xenophobia and racism in a society that has thus far been carefully cultivated for multiracial harmony. So I'll end with a provocation, which is that if policy corrections are not more decisively implemented now, the conditions may become ripe soon for a new middle class politics of populist authoritarianism in Singapore. So I'll end there. Thank you.